Welcome everyone to week 8. This week we are going to be talking about the 20s, the boom and the bust of it all. And this is about halfway through the semester, so congratulations, you've made it about halfway through. And you have a break next week, so I hope you enjoy that. But in the meantime, let's get into the 20s and we'll start with the booming economy. The chief business of the American people, said Calvin Coolidge, who became president after Warren G. Harding's sudden death from a heart attack in 1923, is business. Rarely in American history had economic growth seemed more dramatic, cooperation between business and government so close, and business values so widely shared. After a sharp post-war recession that lasted into 1922, the 1920s were a decade of prosperity. Productivity and economic output rose dramatically as new industries, chemicals, aviation, electronics flourished, and older ones like food processing and manufacture of household appliances adopted Henry Ford's assembly line. During the 1920s, consumer goods of all kinds proliferated, marketed by salesmen and advertisers who promoted them as ways of satisfying Americans' psychological desires and everyday needs. Frequently purchased on credit through new installment buying plans, they rapidly altered daily life. These products included telephones, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and refrigerators. These devices transformed work in the home and reduced the demand for domestic servants. Americans spend more and more of their income on leisure activities like vacations, movies, and sporting events. By 1929, weekly movie attendance had reached 80 million, double the figure of 1922. Radios and phonographs brought mass entertainment into American living rooms. The number of radios in Americans' homes rose from 190,000 in 1923 to just under 5 million in 1929. But prosperity had its limits. The fruits of increased production were very unequally distributed. Real wages for industrial workers, again that's wages adjusted to take account of inflation, rose just 1/4 between 1922 and 1929, but corporate profits rose at more than twice that rate. In 1929, 1% of the nation's banks controlled half of its financial resources. At the beginning of 1929, the share of national income of the wealthiest 5% of American families exceeded that of the bottom 60%. A majority of American families had no savings, and an estimated 40% of the population remained in poverty, unable to participate in the flourishing consumer economy. Improved productivity meant goods could be produced with fewer workers. The number of people in manufacturing jobs decreased 5% in the 1920s, the first such drop in the nation's history. Nor did farmers share in the decade's prosperity. Thanks to mechanization and the increased use of fertilizer and insecticides, agricultural production continued to rise even when government subsidies ended and world demand stagnated. As a result, farm incomes declined steadily, and banks foreclosed tens of thousands of farms whose owners were unable to meet mortgage payments. For women, the achievement of suffrage in 1920 eliminated the bond of unity between various activists. Black feminists insisted that the movement must now demand enforcement of the 15th Amendment in the South, but they won little support from their white counterparts. The long-standing division between two competing conceptions of women's freedom, one based on motherhood, the other based on individual autonomy and the right to work, now crystallized in the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, proposed by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, proposed to eliminate all legal distinctions on account of sex. According to Paul, with the right to vote, women no longer needed special legal protections. Instead, they needed equal access to employment, education, and all the other opportunities of citizens. In the end, as you read, the ERA campaign failed, but while political feminism faded, the pre-war feminist demand for personal freedom survived in the vast consumer marketplace and in the actual behavior of the decade's much publicized liberated women. The new woman surfaced as female liberation became a lifestyle. No longer one element in a broader program of social reform, sexual freedom now meant individual autonomy or personal rebellion. With her bobbed hair, short skirts, public smoking and drinking, and unapologetic use of birth control methods, the young single flapper epitomized the change in standards of sexual behavior, at least in large cities. The new woman frequented dance halls and music clubs. She attended sexually charged Hollywood films. What had been scandalous a generation earlier, that is, women's self conscious pursuit of personal pleasure, became a device to market goods from automobiles to cigarettes. In 1904, a woman had been arrested for smoking in public in New York City. 2 decades later, advertisers masterminded a campaign to persuade women to smoke, dubbing cigarettes women's, quote, torches of freedom. The new phase of freedom was only available during one phase of a woman's life. Once married, women were expected to seek freedom within the confines of the home, finding liberation in the use of new labor-saving appliances like washing machines. Okay, so the new woman was a temporary status reserved for single women, and it was given up at the time of marriage. Okay, so that was a huge sexual revolution, but it was a temporary one phase of a woman's life. Although many Americans embraced modern urban culture with its religious and ethnic pluralism, mass entertainment, and liberated sexual rules, others found it alarming. Many evangelical Protestants felt threatened by the decline of traditional values and the increased visibility of Catholicism and Judaism because of immigration. Much of the press portrayed fundamentalism as a movement of backwoods bigots. In fact, it was a national phenomenon. Fundamentalism remained an important strain of 1920s culture and politics. Prohibition, which fundamentalists strongly supported, succeeded in reducing the consumption of alcohol, as well as public drunkenness and drink-related diseases. Too many Americans, however, deemed prohibition a violation of individual freedoms. Prohibition led to large profits for the owners of illegal speakeasies and the bootleggers who supplied them. It produced widespread corruption as police and public officials accepted bribes to turn a blind eye to violations of the law. These developments reinforced fundamentalists' identification of urban life and modern notions of freedom with immorality and the decline of Christian liberty. Fundamentalism illustrates the culture wars that took place during the 1920s, with modernization and sexual liberation as a counterpart to the fundamentalist view. In 1925, a trial in Tennessee threw into sharp relief the division between traditional values and secular modern culture. John Scopes, a teacher in a Tennessee public school, was arrested for violating a state law that prohibited the teaching of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. His trial became a national sensation, and the proceedings were even carried live on national radio. The Scopes trial reflected the enduring tension between two definitions of American freedom. Fundamentalist Christians, strongest in rural areas of the South and West, clung to the traditional idea of moral liberty, that is, voluntary adherence to time-honored religious beliefs. The theory of evolution contradicted the biblical account of creation. Those who upheld the Tennessee law identified evolutionists with feminists, socialists, and religious modernists, all of whom, they claimed, substituted human judgment for the Word of God. To Scopes' defenders, including the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which had persuaded him to violate the law in order to test its constitutionality, freedom meant above all the right to independent thought and individual self-expression. To them, the Tennessee law offered a lesson in the dangers of religious intolerance and the merger of church and state. Kind of amazing how two different groups can view one law so differently. The renowned labor lawyer Clarence Darrow defended Scopes. The jury found Scopes guilty, although the Tennessee Supreme Court later overturned the decision. Fundamentalists retreated for many years from battles over public education, preferring to build their own colleges and schools. The battle would be rejoined, however, toward the end of the 20th century, when fundamentalism reemerged as an important force in politics. To this day, the teaching of the theory of evolution in public schools arouses intense debate in some parts of the country. Few features of urban life seemed more alien to rural and small-town native-born Protestants than their immigration populations and cultures. The wartime obsession with 100% Americanism continued into the 20s. This was a movement that celebrated all things American while attacking foreign and non-American people, ideas, and cultures. During World War I, German Americans bore the brunt of this movement, while also affecting other European immigrants. The 1920s was a decade of citizenship education programs in public schools, legally sanctioned visits to immigrants' homes to investigate their household arrangements, and vigorous efforts by employers to instill appreciation for American values. Perhaps the most menacing expression of the idea that enjoyment of American freedom should be limited on religious and ethnic grounds was the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s. The new Klan attacked a far broader array of targets than during Reconstruction. American civilization, it insisted, was endangered not only by blacks but by immigrants, especially Jews and Catholics, and all the forces that endangered individual liberty, which included feminism, unions, and immorality. The Klan's influence faded in 1925 when its leader in Indiana was convicted of assaulting a young woman. But the Klan's attacks on modern secular culture and its demand that the control of the nation be returned to citizens of the old stock reflected sentiments widely shared in the 1920s. The decade witnessed a flurry of legislation that offered a new answer to the venerable question, who is an American, including the previously discussed Immigration Act of 1924, which set up quotas and completely barred the entry of people from Asia into the U.S. So remember that Immigration Act of 1924 that set up the quotas for people coming from certain countries, and it completely barred the entry of people from Asia into the U.S. So right now, that seems like a good place to pause with our 100% Americanism to talk about Voices of Freedom document Meyer versus Nebraska. All right, so this week we've talked about a couple of different things, and one of those is reaction to immigrants and immigration. So I want to talk about document 136, which is Meyer versus Nebraska and the meaning of liberty. It's on page 151. Now, to avoid any confusion, the very first part of the document talks about the original decision, which was upholding the violation of the law of teaching. So I just wanted to tell you that SCOTUS ruled opposite, right? So this is a Supreme Court case, Supreme Court of the United States, all the way up at the top court. What was Meyer versus Nebraska? Yes.
Robert Meyer violated a 1919 law by teaching German in Nebraska.
Yes, he was a school teacher, and you weren't allowed to teach in non-English, and he did, and he got in trouble. So the Supreme Court of Nebraska had ruled that he, in fact, should be in trouble for it, and the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So why does the Supreme Court see the law as an unreasonable infringement on liberty? Yes.
Well, on page 154, they said the protection of the Constitution extends to those who speak other languages, as well as to those born with English on the tongue.
Right, very good. Yes. So the point of the Supreme Court here was that not everybody who lives in the United States, be it citizens included, speak English or speak English as a first language. And so part of being in the United States is hearing all these different languages. And we got into this a little bit when we talked about immigration in earlier weeks. Very good. All right, that was a good discussion. The 1920s also witnessed an upsurge of self-consciousness among Black Americans. With European immigration all but halted, the Great Migration of World War I, which we discussed in the Progressive Lecture, continued apace. Nearly 1 million blacks left the South during the 1920s, and the black population of New York, Chicago, and other urban centers more than doubled. New York's Harlem gained an international reputation as the capital of Black America, a mecca for migrants from the South and immigrants from the West Indies, 150,000 of whom entered the U.S. between 1900 and 1930. Unlike the Southern newcomers, most of whom had been agricultural workers, The West Indians included a large number of well-educated professional and white-collar workers. Their encounter with American racism appalled them. "I had heard of prejudice in America," wrote the poet and novelist Claude McKay, who emigrated from Jamaica in 1912, "but never dreamed of it being so intensely bitter," he said. The 1920s became famous for slumming, as groups of whites visited Harlem's dance halls, jazz clubs, and speakeasies in search of exotic adventure. The Harlem of the white imagination was a place of primitive passions, free from the puritanical restraints of mainstream American culture. The real Harlem was a community of widespread poverty, its residents confined to low-wage jobs and, because housing discrimination barred them from other neighborhoods, forced to pay exorbitant rents. Most Harlem businesses were owned by whites. Even the famed Cotton Club excluded black customers and employed only light-skinned dancers in its chorus line. Few blacks, north or south, shared in the prosperity of the 1920s. But it is important to note that Harlem also contained a vibrant black cultural community that established links with New York's artistic mainstream. Poets and novelists like Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, and Claude McKay were befriended and sponsored by white intellectuals and published by white presses. Broadway, for the first time, presented black actors in serious dramatic roles. At the same time, the theater in Harlem flourished, freeing black writers and actors from the constraints imposed by white producers. The term New Negro, associated in politics with Pan-Africanism and the militancy of the Garvey movement, in art meant something different. In art, New Negro meant the rejection of established stereotypes and a search for black values to put in their place. This quest led the writers to what came to be known as the Harlem Renaissance, to the roots of the black experience, Africa, the rural South's folk traditions, and the life of the urban ghetto. Harlem Renaissance writings also contained a strong element of protest. This mood was exemplified by Claude McKay's poem If We Must Die, a response to the race riots of 1919. The poem affirmed that blacks would no longer allow themselves to be murdered defenselessly by whites. He said, quote, "If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round at us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accused lot. Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back." End quote. And that seems like a great place to pause, and we will now discuss the bust as we get into the late 20s and the beginnings of the Great Depression in part 2 of the lecture video.